Hi everyone, welcome to this session, the last session of the third day of the Open Food Conference. First of all, I would like to thank the Belgian presidency for inviting us to host an event here, and thank you all for joining this session. I know it's the last one, so you probably have been here all day, but I promise it's worth it. My name is Claudia Svedu. I work at Europe Jacques Delors, so the host of this session, as a policy analyst working on green trade matters. And for those who don't know, Europe Jacques Delors is a Brussels-based think tank working on sustainability matters in Europe. Among other things, we work on how to green EU's agri-food policy and how to green EU's trade policy. And I work a bit on an interface of both, but with a bit more emphasis on green trade policy. The topic of today's event, I guess the topic, now you have it on the screen, but the topic of today's event, I guess the title is self-explanatory. We'll focus on open strategic autonomy and the sustainability of the European food system, and I'm very honored to be joined by three very renowned panelists. But before I jump into the introductions, I was given the nearly impossible task to sum up a bit the discussions around open strategic autonomy in the food sector in a couple of minutes. And I'll start with the why. Why did we decide to organize this event on this very topic? As you all know, the COVID pandemic and the war in Ukraine and the extreme weather events caused by climate change has given, with all of these events, the EU was confronted with a harsh truth. Our food systems are not as resilient as we thought. They're vulnerable to external shocks, to climate change, and therefore are not as resilient as we thought. So we need a new way forward. And if we thought back then that this was a very relevant topic when we first conceptualized this event, this is even more important now as we see farmers' protests arising all over Europe in this very challenging current political context. And I think farmers' protests are very much a paradigmatic example of some of the key issues arising in the context of open strategic autonomy in the food systems in Europe, right? Among other things, it raises, farmers are concerned about who will bear the cost of the green transition, like the implementation of green measures, green agri-food measures will come at a cost. And the second, I would say, big concern pertains to competitiveness, as EU imports not always comply, or almost never comply, have to comply with the EU environmental standards. So farmers all over Europe are concerned that the EU market will be flooded with imports from third countries that simply do not live up to our environmental standards. So it's against this background that this session is being hosted in a current political context that is highly polarized, and Europe is confronted with a dilemma, which in my view is a false dilemma, which is how to carry on our sustainability agenda when it comes also to greening our agri-food systems while maintaining Europe's competitiveness. But I think one thing is true. In the current context, we see rising challenges arising from climate change. We see a system that clearly does not work for the most vulnerable actors in the European agri-food supply chains. So keeping the status quo and business as usual is not an option. But I guess the million-dollar question is, how can we ensure that we will be more sustainable and ensure more resilient food systems in a challenging political context in the next EU cycle? So this conversation couldn't be more timely. But before I jump to discussion, and I know that the concept of open strategic autonomy might not be as straightforward to anyone, especially for outside of the Brussels bubble. And there are several definitions put forward for what does open strategic autonomy means. The one on the screen is the one put forward by the European Commission, but is by no means the only one. For instance, the European Parliament defines open strategic autonomy as the ability to act autonomously, to rely on one's resources in key strategic areas, and to cooperate with partners whenever needed. So it's a broad concept. It means different things for different people. depending on who you ask to. But at the end of the day, it's about balancing cooperation with ensuring autonomy. So this idea of as much cooperation as possible and as much autonomy as needed. And such a broad concept, of course, it raises a lot of questions on how can this be implemented in practice. Especially if we look at the agri-food sector, what does it mean to have an open strategic autonomy approach to the agri-food sector? How can this be achieved, and what are the implications? For instance, if we think about enlargement, it's one of the key arguments for pro-enlargement is the fact that it will make Europe more self-sufficient. For instance, countries like Ukraine, which are like the second largest exporter of cereals. On the other hand, enlargement also poses questions regarding our common agriculture policy and the financing, and so several member states are concerned with the fact that before they were net beneficiaries and now they might become net payers of CAP money. So there are several, it's a very, very complex topic, and if it raises questions internally, it also raises questions on the external dimension and on our trade policy, and to what extent looking inwards will be perceived as protectionism by our trading partners. And in all of these discussions, we should not forget that for our green transition, we also need to cooperate. We also need third countries. They are essential. And without them, we will not be able to achieve our common shared goals. So it's complex. There are internal and external dimensions to it, and this is why we have these renowned panelists here with us to provide us different perspectives. We have representatives from academia, civil society, in this case a think tank, and from the institutions, which will bring a diverse array of expertise, will provide us with economic perspective, with environmental perspective, in a more trade, social dimension. So I'll start by introducing them, starting with the last one, Alan Matthews. We'll have to leave a bit earlier, by the way, so whenever you raise your questions, please keep that in mind. Who's a professor emeritus of European Agriculture Policy in Trinity College, Dublin. Alan Matthews, I guess, needs no introduction for those of you who attended previous sessions, but he has worked as a consultant for the Parliament, for the OECD, for the FIO, and other UN agencies. And he will address the economic perspective of this open strategic autonomy approach to agri-food systems. Then on my right, I have Geneviève Pons, who's the Director General and Vice President of Europe Jacques Delors. She has also served in several management positions at the European Commission, and she's the former director of the WWF's European office, and she will provide us with the environmental perspective to the topic. And then on my left, I have Sergi Corbalan, who's current advisor on international trade for the Greens in the European Parliament. And prior to that, Sergi was over a decade, if I'm not mistaken, the former executive director of the Fair Trade Advocacy Office in Brussels. And he will address the social and international trade perspective of the topic. And before we jump into the discussion, some housekeeping rules. So I'll address 2 short questions to the speakers, who will have 5 minutes. I'll try to be strict, but stick to the time. And of course, feel free to expand on each other's remarks, to jump in and to follow up. And I think that's about it. So let's start the discussion. And I'll start with you, Alan Matthews. And I guess I'll start with the bad news, which I think all of you probably by now know, which is the EU is dependent on imports of certain inputs and commodities, such as feedstock. I mean, for instance, a recent study highlighted that 97% of the total use of soybean meal in Europe was imported, 97, which is quite a high percentage. So my question to you, Alan, is given these dependencies, what does open strategic autonomy approach mean for the EU agri-food system?
Thanks very much, Claudia. And as those of you who are at the morning session will recognize, I'm getting a second bite of the cherry here. So I'll keep my intervention fairly short and let you hear some new voices. By background, I'm an economist. So I would generally take a positive view of the role of trade. And of course, any of you who've taken an introductory economics course will realize that the basic argument for trade is an efficiency one, that essentially by having the possibility to export, we can use our resources in a more productive way and gain a higher value added on those resources, and that when we import, we can get access to consumer goods, raw materials, and so on at a cheaper price. And again, that is makes a contribution to an improved standard of living. Now, that's a very simplistic argument because it focuses purely on this efficiency outcome. Of course, we know trade has other impacts. It has environmental impacts, and I'm going to let Sergei talk about that. What I want to sort of focus on in this opening remark is the fact that trade does bring additional risks with it. And clearly, we have become more conscious of those additional risks in the recent few years. So if I just look at some of the sort of trade policy shocks which the European agri-food sector has been subjected to. I mean, go back to the original Russian invasion of Crimea, where the European Union imposed sanctions on Russia, and in return, Russia then effectively prohibited the import of a range of European food products, which had particular negative impacts on, for example, Polish apple producers, on the pork industry at the time, and so on. More recently, we've had tariff wars. We've had the United States imposing tariffs on Spanish table olives. Sergio, you're probably very familiar with that particular one, which again, caused negative impacts. We often see countries imposing SPS, sanitary and phytosanitary restrictions on grounds which sometimes can be hard to justify. I would be aware, for example, that China would use that as a way of putting pressure, for example, on Australian exports to China, where Australia takes the position that China doesn't particularly approve of. They suddenly increase the stringency of their so-called SPS checks, and we see a lot of Australian exports being rejected. On the other side of the fence, in terms of export restrictions, we see countries, when world prices increase dramatically, we see countries like India, for example, imposing export restrictions on the export of rice, which, in a turn, if you're an import-dependent country, say Senegal in Africa, and you're depending on those imports, suddenly they become either extremely expensive or indeed unavailable. So we did have the World Trade Organization, and in particular the Agreement on Agriculture in 1994, which was intended to introduce a greater degree of predictability around trade. And to a large extent in the early years, I think it achieved that aim. And we did see agri-food trade flows growing more rapidly than production. But we're all aware that the WTO, it's just finished its 13th Ministerial Council meeting, and it is becoming increasingly ineffective. We know the dispute settlement system doesn't work any longer. It's difficult for it to update and modernize its agreements, which is clearly needed. And therefore, the EU has sort of, in this very changed global environment, also in terms of changed geopolitics, introduced this concept of open strategic autonomy. And as I understand it, and Claudia has already told us there are different interpretations, it has to do partly with ensuring that there is less vulnerability in supply chains, and in particular for critical industries, for example, semiconductors, the industries necessary for the net zero transition, that we actually are not dependent on sort of unfriendly countries for these imports. And it's also to do with strengthening the robustness of supply chains. And both of those issues, have some resonance when we come to relate that concept to the food sector. Food is slightly different, I think, because when you think about building, let's say, a semiconductor factory, which is a hugely expensive undertaking, but in principle, there's no reason why it couldn't be located in Germany rather than in Taiwan. It's essentially a set of plans, and if you have the ecosystem in terms of the skills and the sub-suppliers and so on, there's no reason why you cannot install or create such a factory in any European country. Food is somewhat different because clearly there are different different agro ecosystems around the world. We cannot grow everything ourselves in Europe. We're well aware of that. So trade is always going to be an essential part of a resilient agri-food trade system. I tried to make that point in my talk this morning. But are we too vulnerable? Are there sources of vulnerability that we should be aware of, and that we should attempt to address, maybe to mitigate those sources of vulnerability, or in other ways? And to me, there's two sort of ways of thinking about this. One is that clearly in terms of food availability, and that is something which has risen in the agenda in the wake of some of these crises that we've had. But food availability, we can interpret that in two ways. Is it maintaining what consumers expect to find in their local supermarket? In other words, the 30,000 different products that they go in and that they expect to be able to choose. Is that what we mean by food availability? Or is it that Europe, as it must do, maintains the ability to provide a nutritious food supply for its population? Because those are two very different things. Because we know that there is considerable excess consumption, whether in terms of calories, in terms of proteins. We know that we use 2/3, for example, of our cereals production goes into animal feed, and you know, there is a loss of not a loss of value, but a loss of what word am I looking for? A loss of nutrients along that chain. So, you know, if Europe were exposed to a reduction, for example, in protein imports, which, to be honest, is probably one of the more reliable sources of import. I would be much more worried about our dependence, for example, on imports of fertilizer, phosphate rock, even fossil fuel energy, than I would be about Brazil or the United States not being willing to sell soybeans to us. But let's assume that that were the case. Yes, there would be an adjustment in the animal sector, and that would be difficult, as I say, for those producing those products, and it would certainly affect consumers if they're expecting to find those 30,000 products on the supermarket shelves. But it's not really a threat to our nutrition availability. We have issues around the use of land for biofuels, which is also another way in which we can ensure food security without having to actually think about restricting imports. So I think I share Claudia's view that maybe some of the responses we've had in the food sector to this idea of open strategic autonomy are not necessarily well-founded. I think it is important we look at vulnerabilities, but we do so in a sort of fact-based way. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. It was a very, very comprehensive introductory remarks. I mean, you touch upon pretty much every point, right? Like, in any trade talk, everyone talks about the economic argument for trade, but there is much more. Trade also causes risks, as you very much pointed out. Food security is not the same as food availability. So, well, I'm not. That was a great introductory remarks, and now I will move on to Geneviève, because there is one thing that it wasn't. There is one thing that I would like to ask regarding the environment, because we know that global food systems also pose a threat to the environment. There are several environmental challenges associated with it, associated with European production, but also with European consumption, environmental degradation inside and outside of Europe. There's a bunch of evidence confirming that European consumption is associated with, for instance, deforestation in Latin America. So my question to you is, what is the current global food supply? How is the current global food supply chain contributing to climate change and biodiversity loss? And now you have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Claudia. Yes, I think, I suspect at least, that many of you have the answer. But I will anyway give you some elements. We consider that 25% of greenhouse gas emissions globally come from the global food system. But even more than that, agriculture and food production is at the origin of 90% of deforestation. So this is absolutely enormous. And the figure is 75% as far as tropical forests are concerned. And this is mainly due to commodities. You have soja, you have rubber, you have palm oil. So many things that we use in our agri-food system. So obviously, we should try to address this situation. And for that, we have to understand what is the origin of these phenomena, and which one are in a certain manner unavoidable because of demographic factors, and which one can be tackled. So, first point about deforestation, the way we feed ourselves. In developed countries, the consumption of meat has grown in a very considerable manner. So a high consumption of meat is linked with a high level of development. And we see in countries that were not used to consume meat, like China, we see that with a rising level of development, there is also a rising level of meat consumption. The problem of a high consumption of meat is the way animals are fed. And especially, and Claudia referred to it in her remarks, it is responsible of a lot of deforestation, notably in Latin America, because we feed our cattle with soja coming from this part of the world. We know also that meat is not good for our health. Too much meat is not good for our health. So we should be brave enough to look honestly at the way we feed ourselves and to try to change our diets. I say brave enough because each time the Commission has tried to propose something in this domain to the European Parliament, there had been a lot of resistance, and we are not yet able to look at the manner we feed ourselves in a honest and brave manner. So that's probably the first point. Second point, there are some damages that should be avoided because we do not benefit from them. All the ones which are linked with waste. We consider that 30% of the food produced is wasted. And this is something that we should tackle because it will not reduce the food available for consumption. I may stop here for the moment, but you have two main tracks to be considered. Maybe I will add another one. Everything which is linked with inputs, and especially pesticides and fertilizers, which in their production and use emit a lot of greenhouse gases, and also are very detrimental to biodiversity. So for the time being, I have mainly spoken about deforestation, but we should more globally speak about biodiversity loss and soil degradation. We consider in Europe that more than 70%, I think it's near 80%, of our soils are in very poor state, and this is due to the inputs that we use. And of course, it will mean that we will not be able to continue to produce as much as we have done so far. So it is not only an environmental problem, it's also a health problem, of course, but it's also an economic problem. So these are some of the aspects of the environmental damages produced by our agri-food system and our diet, and that should be tackled.
Thank you very much, Geneviève, for your introductory remarks as well. I would like to pick up on something you said that I find particularly interesting, which is the link between environment and development. Every time we think about environmental degradation, we think about Europe, but also a lot of the environmental degradation associated with EU consumption occurs abroad. And also your point on the resistance that there is in Europe every time something is proposed related to agri-food systems. We've all seen the struggles related to the nature restoration law in the parliament, and I guess Sergi is very much familiar with that. So I'll move on to you, Sergi. If the EU starts looking more inwards, as I said, and starts adopting a more an approach that allows us to become more autonomous and thus focus more on prioritizing local supply chains, for instance, and local production, what would be the consequences for trading partners, especially trading partners in the so-called global south, which is not an expression I love, but it's useful for simplistic reasons. So what's your view on the bigger picture, I guess?
Okay, does it work? Yeah.
Yeah.
So thanks and thanks for your inputs. I'm learning a lot today. Yeah, I mean, this assumption that the open strategic autonomy will lead to more localization is also an assumption, I think, right? Yeah. Because as you said, we do not know really what this means, and I think that everybody kind of interprets it in different ways. I haven't seen for the moment any concrete move from the Commission that seems to indicate that they support localization of trade laws. So I think that one thing is whether France was intending this to be on the agenda when proposing it at EU level, but the fact is that it remains to be seen. So therefore, yeah, we need to see how it evolves and what is the impact, right? Now, I'll come back to the impact, of course, in the South, but I think I want to pick up on the question of efficiency, because I think that before we find what the impact is and how to find solutions to that, we need to recognize that because of what you said, because the only priority was finding efficiency, this was kind of the neoclassical economic model, we end up with a crazy, I would put it in, this is my words, food system and international trade system. We have absurd situations like, for example, Thai shrimps being produced in Thailand, in slave-like working conditions that are exported to Morocco for processing, sent back to China for packaging, and then sent back to Europe for sale. This is the case. We also find ourselves in European, Italian tomatoes being sold in North Africa countries that are displacing local tomato production. We find ourselves in a situation where we've got the Dutch are having a huge political backlash in the Netherlands. There is even a new party that has been set up to address the issue of contamination of the soil in the Netherlands because they've put in place since years a model that is based on the export of pig meat abroad to China and to other countries. So therefore, I mean, we are in the excessive. This is not to say that efficiency is not important, but a sole focus on efficiency has led to absurd situations. So I would say that something that should happen is to put some sense into it. This doesn't mean by banning things. I don't think that banning approaches is necessarily the good thing, but thinking about what are the tools that are available at the disposal of the EU and member states to incentivize the type of trade that we want to promote, and we can discuss what would that be, and disincentivize, as I said, not banning, but nevertheless not particularly incentivizing the kind of trade that has these negative externalities and crazy consequences like the ones that I've just mentioned. Now, to come back, can I? Yeah, if I come back to the actual question, which is the impact on the South. One of the myths that is, I find it a myth, that it's very easy to say, if we localize our food system, this will harm directly, without any doubt, small farmers out of the EU. Well, this, I think, it deserves further reflection. And I think that I don't speak on behalf of small farmers. I cannot speak on behalf of them. But I have met with some of them in the Global South. Their concern is finding a sustainable livelihood for them and their families and their communities, right? I haven't met any farmer in the Global South that is particularly keen on that their products end up in the EU market. If they could sell locally, this would be better for them. So to me, the ultimate vision, we cannot get it there like in 2 years, but I would say that we put in place a food sovereignty framework in Europe so that we rationalize and create a good balance between openness and trade and also self-sufficiency, but also that we help our partner countries to do the same. So that the farmers, they make a living with getting the living income, that agricultural workers get a living wage, and this is something that we should be promoting. Our food security, our food sovereignty, and which includes food security, it should not be seen as to the detriment or as something that is incompatible with the food sovereignty of the trading partners, right? And I think that therefore, and already to start already with solutions, the first thing that we certainly need to do when you are looking at what you can do to improve a situation is do not harm. That's the first thing. And therefore, the first step that the EU should do is stop exporting products that are distorting the food sovereignty of our trading partners. One obvious example is, for example, the examples I've mentioned on tomatoes and so on, but also, for example, this very hypocritical, you may be aware that it is now possible to export certain pesticides that are not authorized for use in the EU. You can still produce them in the EU if you sell them in third countries. Thank God Belgium, for example, has been leader on this and has banned this at national level. But of course, it is not serious, and it cannot be it is an example of how hypocritical trade policy is, that we complain a lot about the imports that we get from the South, but we do not look about how we are making money out of promoting toxic substances in third countries. So I think we need to be looking at these kind of links and actually really partnering up with our trading partners and saying, okay, guys, I mean, what is that you want to do? What is your economic development model? And what can our import and exports from the EU help to contribute to the objectives that you have?
Thank you very much, Sergi. I think we all appreciated, especially, or at least I personally appreciated the concrete examples. I didn't know, for instance, about the shrimp. It's both very interesting and very complex issue. Also, I really appreciated your point on the trading partners, which I think it's something that wasn't particularly taken always into account by the EU, this idea that in order for us to succeed with our policies like the deforestation regulation, it's also important for us to support third countries and to bear in mind that we need them when we transition, and our policies might have an impact on them. But now I will turn back to Alan and focus more on now that we addressed the international dimension, we'll focus a bit more again on the EU. And what are the potential economic risks and benefits for the EU when it opts for more, I mean, I wouldn't like to use the word protectionist, but I mean more, you understand what I mean by the word protectionism, even though in the trade world is the kind of the forbidden word.
May I just take an opportunity to react very quickly to the points that both...
This is intended to be a discussion, I'm no dictator.
No. I really liked your first point and the emphasis on reducing meat consumption. I raised it in the earlier talk this morning. Is it red meat or is it white meat? Because actually if you're concerned about soya and deforestation, it's pig and poultry. Where the soya ends up. Very little cattle eat soya. There's some dairy that would eat soya, but it's the per kilo of meat produced, it's actually white meat. It's pig and poultry. So it's a sort of an interesting debate about, you know, which is the worst of the two. And of course, I totally agree, Sergey, that this very crude emphasis on efficiency can lead us way off, because we don't have proper pricing of all of these environmental damages along the way, and therefore the signals that producers are getting are distorted. And of course, you're absolutely right to highlight that. But the question you ask is there a sort of a potential downside to Europe taking steps to be more limited in its imports? And I guess you're particularly referring to mirror clauses here as a kind of an example. Yeah. And I don't know whether any of you were able to attend the afternoon session yesterday, where Fabian Santini was asked this point about, from the Commission, was asked this point about mirror clauses, and I thought he answered it quite well. I mean, basically, maybe I could highlight what I think is the important policy issue, and then just quickly come to the reactions. The policy issue is that in the discussions on the reformed CAP, the European Parliament put forward an amendment, Article 118, I think it was called, which basically would have said, as a rule, it was going to apply across the board, imports have to meet European production standards. Now, that was deemed a step too far by the Council and also by the Commission, and the agreement was that the Commission would come forward with a think piece where it would look at how, in particular, environmental standards could be required of imports. And it did that. And essentially, its argument was, and I tend to support this, was that this should be done on a case-by-case basis. And in particular, you need to be aware of the international legal context. So where you have a global environmental good or issue, for example, health with the overuse of antibiotics in animals, we now have introduced, it hasn't actually started to be implemented yet, but the legislation is in place where we will simply prevent the import of meat which has been produced either where antibiotics has been used as growth promoters or where antibiotics on a list of antibiotics that have been reserved for human use because of their critical nature have been used in animal production whatsoever. Now that's a global issue. This antimicrobial resistance doesn't recognize any boundaries. We've tried for years, if not decades, to get international agreement on stricter standards, and the EU eventually has resorted to this unilateral or autonomous action. And to me, I would see that as a justified step. But I would have other examples of production standards that we ask of our European farmers, where I wouldn't necessarily see that as being something that I would want to necessarily restrict imports on. So this case-by-case basis seems to me to be right. But there is no doubt that there is a negative reaction. You just have to look at, I said that the WTO had become rather moribund, but in fact there are parts of the WTO that function quite well at the moment. And one is where countries can raise complaints about other countries' policies. And there is almost unanimous criticism of the European Union's use of these unilateral mirror clauses, whether it be in the case of the ban on neonicotinoids, pesticides, or if it's in the case of sustainability clauses related to biofuel production, which Indonesia and Malaysia are strongly opposed. So there is a negative reaction from our partner countries. And I suppose the question for policymakers is that there's always a sort of a higher dimension. There is, of course, the narrow agricultural trade dimension. Is there a gain for both parties if they do agree to trade? But there's also, at this point in our history, there's a geopolitical dimension. Does Europe want to be antagonizing countries that, you know, potentially it would wish to win over in terms of its the conflicts, particularly with Russia and China? So there are those higher level issues that I think, but just be aware that what we think we are introducing in sort of good faith, and we think it's justified, and we think it's good that other countries should try to follow our standards. This is not necessarily how other countries see that, and that's an issue which we would need to address going forward.
Thank you very much, Alan. I very much appreciate the distinction between the justified and the non-justified, which I think it will depend on who you ask to again. And I'm very tempted to ask you which cases you would like, we would think that they're not justified, but I'm not going to put you on the spot. And now turning back to Geneviève, and actually to follow up on something that Sergi mentioned before, which pertains to the length of our supply chains. From agricultural production to transport to packaging. We've seen the example with a Thai shrimp that goes from Thailand back to Morocco to China and ends up in the EU shelves at the supermarkets. So my question to you, Geneviève, is what would an autonomous approach mean to the greening of the food supply chains?
Well, I will come back to the three main factors contributing to environment degradation that I mentioned in my first answers, and see how autonomy would help. So the three main points were diet, waste, and inputs. So if we come back to diet, we would gain in autonomy, but we would gain also in sustainability if we adopt a more plant-based diet. I know it is much easier to say than to do. And especially, it is not easy at all to regulate these issues. And it will be more a cultural effort. And if we look at the young generations, but I would say the young, urban, educated generation, this change of diet is happening. But it is not yet happening for the whole European population. It is not, this change of diet is not taking place. So let's hope that it will happen, because it will be beneficial on both the autonomy aspect and the sustainability aspect. Second point, we spoke about waste. And more autonomy, more local production could help tackle this question of waste. To tackle the question of waste, we need a better organization of supply chains. We need also better packaging, and we need methods like refrigeration. All of these can be probably better tackled at local levels. Third point, less harmful inputs. Once again, chemical inputs like fertilizers and pesticides are not only harmful for sustainability, they are also a factor of dependencies. We import most of them. We import phosphates, we import potash, and we import pesticides. So, how to get rid of them? We should develop alternative products like bio-pesticide, but also alternative methods by better crop rotation or integrated plant disease management techniques. So these are the three main factors of amelioration of both sustainability and autonomy. Then we could add a few methods that I will maybe have time to develop later. With more local production, we can have more traceability. We can also reduce transport duration and transport emissions, but we have to underline that transport emissions are not the main problem. It is overall 6% of the emissions of the sector. It's also possible, of course, by reducing the distance to reduce packaging needs. So there are many manners to combine more sustainability and more autonomy.
Thank you very much, Geneviève. Indeed, there is this myth that transportation is the biggest cause of emissions, and it's not necessarily always the case. And now back to Sergi. As Alan mentioned, third countries are screaming at the EU, at the WTO. They raise concerns regarding the mirror measures, but also regulations like the deforestation regulation and the impacts on third countries. Some of these measures might be perceived as unjustified, as protectionism, as not having a legal or scientific basis behind. So my question to you is, as the EU is thinking of adopting more and more mirror measures, or at least that is in the public debate, but at the same time is still looking to sign trade agreements, which is a big part of our trade policy, to diversify, to find new trading partners, to decrease dependencies. How will this impact international cooperation? How will all this match between autonomous measures on the one hand, with the EU acting unilaterally, and the EU's objectives to sign free trade agreements? How will this impact, or how is this already impacting, I would say, international cooperation?
Yes. The fact is that there is no regulatory alignment on all topics at global level. This is impossible, right? Yeah. I mean, you could say it's ideal, but it's dreaming. And so the fact is that there are some consensus on certain points that have been reached. And I think that whenever, that should be always the goal, try to find consensus and common agreements on international level, because by default, when referring to these standards, by default, you're avoiding that it has negative trade impact. So I think that would be the cursor to say, as much as possible, keep on trying. But there are topics like the fight against deforestation, or for example, animal welfare, which is kind of the other side of the coin of the cultural change that Geneviève was referring to, where the developments in Europe are not the same as in other places. This is not to say that we are better, but I think, but it's different. Actually, the legislation sometimes, because sometimes we need to decolonialize our thinking as well before we can decolonialize trade policy. In organic regulations, for example, I also learned a lot when I realized that in my Eurocentric approach, I was thinking that the EU organic agriculture rules were better, this was my thinking, than other organic rules. And then I learned that in many EU trading partners, organic rules, for example, do include, for example, some animal welfare considerations, whereas ours don't. So the first thing that we need to decolonialize our minds is that it's not because it's different that it's worse in other countries. That is the first thing. Now, the fact is, however, it can be worse. You can get into semantics, but the rules are not the same, and it's normal. We don't have a global government. So therefore, it's about how to manage that. Now, I think that mirror clauses, which would be kind of applying exactly the same import standards as if applied, as if produced here, can be problematic if there are no certain flexibilities that are put in place. Because you cannot compare growing the same product in West Europe to the Caribbean, and therefore the need for pesticides or other substances, of course, you cannot compare. Therefore, I think that the concept of, as I said, international alignment whenever possible, and when there is not alignment, trying to find equivalence agreements, I believe that it is a very good direction to go towards, which allows for certain differences while keeping the overall level of protection of the environment and consumers in an equivalent way, which means details are different. It's a bit like at EU law, there is a difference between a directive and a regulation. So a directive also says the legislation in Spain should be more or less have the same objectives as the Belgian one, but the details can be different. So I think something like that we have applied for the internal market development, we should also apply in international trade. Again, to decolonialize our thinking, I think it's very important as well that we take off this hat of the we know better. And this is what annoys trading partners a lot. Like and I think that this backlash by trade diplomats against certain of our rules are a lot about how we communicate and how they perceive it, more the actual content of the legislation, right? So I think there is a lot to do about how we can be humble as well, how we can stop giving lessons all the time. Let's not forget, for example, that if we look at banana, which is a sector that I know, it was the Europeans and the Americans that have promoted the lack of biodiversity in bananas that is now creating risks in terms of pests. So if we hadn't messed up the biodiversity that existed already, they would be in need of less pesticides. So if we don't start with this humbleness and awareness, then of course we don't start the conversation in the right way. So no surprise that they're upset. And also, more technical, things like when you plan, let's say in those cases like deforestation or animal welfare, you want to introduce something that you know there is no consensus. Well, then you'd need to make, as an EU, and the Commission in particular, needs to make special efforts, but special efforts to be as didactic, engaging, and listening, but before the legislation is even proposed, and do it with sufficient time so that other partners can give input, can give suggestions, can explain this is how we do it, this works for us, we agree with the objective, but we do it this way. And in a way that feedback is sought. Then when it comes to the implementation, give sufficient time for implementation, not expect that things can be ready like this, and not be blind to the fact that regulatory changes have impact downstream. And the weak actors end up paying the cost of such regulatory changes very often. So giving time for adaptation without fines, without sanctions, so that everybody gets there. It's better to take time, but do it well, than rush through and then create opposition. And of course, also technical and financial support when we are expecting producers in third countries to meet requirements that are not theirs. Because if we only ask and we don't offer support, this is again very neo-colonial, right? So that's why in terms of administrative cooperation between the competent authorities on a certain topic, in terms of financing support in least developed countries in particular, when they need to put in place systems that may not exist. I do not know, maybe they exist, maybe they don't, but whenever needed, I mean, these would be, to me, essential elements that would not remove the fact that we have regulatory differences, but at least it would swallow the pill in a way, in an easier way, and it would work better, I think, in the long run.
Thank you very much, Sergi. You really touched whole points. It's something, especially the one on equivalence, is something we hear a lot from third countries, this idea that the EU is disregarding the local measures that are already in place there. It's one of their key concerns, and I think at the end of the day, it's really a communication, an underlying communication issue, that no one's really questioning our objectives, but how we are putting them forward. And now, unless any of the panelists would like to follow up after Sergi, I will open the floor for questions. And I will just quickly ask you to introduce yourself before asking a question and trying to be as short as possible. Any questions in the room? If not, I really don't mind starting. I have a few. The gentleman over there. I don't know if there is a mic. There is a mic coming your way. Could I ask you to pass that down? Thank you so much.
Thank you. My name is Andreas Turner. I'm from Austria. I'm representing farmers' interests, and I'm also a member of the European and Economic Social Committee. Interesting debate, and a question came into my mind when we talk about an open strategic autonomy for the European food system, labeling of origin for food products. What do you think? Would that support the strengthening of the European food system in making consumers know this is a product from Europe and therefore produced according to European standards, and they can consider this in their buying decision? So origin labeling, what do you think on this?
Thank you very much. Anyone else? And then I'll come back to the panel. If not, I will... Oh, okay.
Hi, Koen de Keizer from ECDPM. How compatible is strategic autonomy and sustainability? Because, you know, Genevieve said that there are sort of, you know, synergies between the two goals. But if I look at how both the French and the Italian Ministry of Agriculture sort of changed and added to their name as well, you know, food sovereignty, really, alimentaire de souveraineté, to their name of their department. And then doing actions like trying to produce more soya within Europe, I wonder how sustainable actually is this pursuing of strategic autonomy. Does this make meeting the European Green Deal harder? Thank you.
The lady at the back, and then I'll come back to the panel.
Thank you. My name is Almudena. I work for FIAN, which is a human rights organization. And my question is, like, the agreement of agriculture of the GATT, we've seen after 30 years that has served very little to relieve hunger or to reactivate economies in poorest countries. And we get used to consume cheap food based on these free trade agreements. So now that the protests in the street from farmers against the free trade agreement of Mercosur, and we see Macron now trying to revitalize this agreement, do you think there is any possibility to integrate a human rights approach in these free trade agreements, like based on self-sufficiency, and I'm not talking about autarky, but based on self-sufficiency of countries, and solidarity and cooperation? Thanks.
Thank you very much. So human rights approach to FTAs, labeling, and how compatible are these two objectives, the open strategic autonomy and sustainability? Who wants to start? Alan needs to leave, so we'll give him priority.
I do apologize. I have a flight in an hour. So, but just to be very quick, because I'm going to disappear, the origin labeling, I'm not an expert, but don't we have country of origin labeling in the EU? I mean, the debate was whether you could have national country of origin. I mean, but I'm not an expert, but okay. So that's the okay. Most things when I look at labels tell me where the product was coming from. So anyway, but on the sustainability and strategic autonomy synergy or trade-off. I mean, you specifically mentioned soybeans. It's interesting that actually we did have soybean production in Europe, in Romania, but it disappeared because it was genetically modified seed, and that's not permitted in the European Union. So we were not competitive, and it just disappeared. So we could have been growing soybeans, but the regulations didn't allow it. Anyway, on that point, I'm going to unfortunately have to miss the rest of the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Alan.
Thank you very much, Alan. Merci. Good trip back. Good trip back. I will take the two first questions. Unfortunately, I am not sure that I have understood the third one. Maybe Claudia will repeat it for me. But on the two first questions, we need consumers to go in the right direction. And so labels are very useful. And if we want to bring consumers with us, we must be able to give them the relevant informations about not only country of origin, which is your question, but this is important, but also the way it has been produced. And we must find ways to encourage consumers to help the necessary green transition, but in manners that will bring revenues to the farmers that embark in this transition. So labels are a very important tool. Second, food sovereignty and food sustainability do not always go together. So what I have tried to identify is the intersection between these two ensembles. And it must, well, I am not sure that it is such a vast intersection. And there are many occurrences of conflict between sustainability and autonomy. I take one. If you import tomatoes from Morocco, they will have been produced in a much more sustainable way than if they are produced under, gas feeding in Netherlands, for instance. That's one example. We can even find examples that are even more striking. So sustainability and autonomy do not always go together, but we can find manners to maximize both of them. I stop here because unfortunately I have not understood the third question.
Maybe Sergi, if you want to.
Yes, of course. So just to say that I agree, Geneviève, with you. I think on the country of origin thing, I think that it seems to me like very meaningful information, as well as many other information that could be provided to the consumer, because the market works if you've got informed consumer choices. I'm optimistic also with technologies and what this offers in terms of for the consumer that wants to know more. Now it's not anymore a classical label that is a tool. Like there's QR codes and many other ways now where, for example, this exists for batteries already, where the digital passport of batteries is there. So we're going more to a traceability of products that using digital technologies that will enable us, the motivated consumer, which will not be maybe the average in every case, but the ones that want to know more about where the product is from, but also indeed what kind of production method and the prices as well, because I think that is an element that is often forgotten, and it is fundamental, I think, and also very important for many consumers. Now, in relation to the question by Almudena, and good to see you here, I mean, I understood if the trade agreements and trade policy in agriculture would be compatible with self-sufficiency and human rights, if there would be a way to make it compatible. I mean, I think it's a very big question and a very big ask, and certainly I think it should be a direction to get there. Some of the tips were things that can be done, for example, in relation to human rights, is, for example, to already ban the worst violations of human rights. So, for example, you may have heard that actually yesterday there was a political agreement on the forced labor regulation, right, which aims at eradicating forced labor from EU supply chains. This is great news. We should be very happy about it, I find. It went quickly, it went well, and it shows that when there is something to... it's easier to find consensus on the worst things and to eradicate them and put responsibility on companies. It is more difficult in the kind of human rights, like the right to food, for example, that I know that, of course, you advocate for, and rightfully so, and food sovereignty, because that is less of a objectifiable... I'm not weakening it, but it's easier to see if there is forced labor. It is much more debatable if the right to food of a certain population has been agreed or not, because it's very complex, right? So therefore, I think that's the problem with the... Not the problem with the right to food, but the problem that I think that trade policy should change in many different ways so as to contribute to the right to food and the food sovereignty of other countries. And the first thing we need to do is to ask them. So if we, when I say them, it's the countries that we want to speak to. And also I would want to say kind of a process recommendation is that I wouldn't leave trade policy negotiations to trade policy officials. But I'm not talking about the EC, I'm talking about the trading partners as well. Because the issue of who calls the shots in trade ministries is something that is also very important to know. Typically, trade ministries, I'm not saying exclusively, but they cater to the interests of industries that want to make money by exporting, and they help to gain markets abroad. So a lot of countries in Latin America, for example, same as the EU, but I mean in Latin America, if trade policy works for the exporters of agri-food products, and they have a policy that helps them to place their commodities and cash crops, but if you ask the small farmers, they may not agree on that policy. Maybe it's not the best, actually, policy. So, and often I find that in these discussions about the EU and the rest, if you speak to the trade minister of a country, they will look at it from a trade perspective and more quickly will say, oh, we don't like the... Where if you speak to maybe the minister responsible for deforestation or for food sovereignty in the country, they will give a very different answer. So therefore, in a way, politicizing trade policy can be good in terms of let's have the prime ministers discuss the main deals and the main elements of trade policy. And also, if I can say something else as well, also in the EU. So I'm not in the EU, this is my personal opinion, but I do believe that DG Trade is heavily influenced by the need to find export markets abroad and is okay to give in some market access concessions. So because very often the trade negotiators and trading partners, what they want is to gain market access to the EU market for agricultural products, right? And then we get where we are now. So that I think is problematic. So therefore, more political accountability of trade policy making in the EU would be interesting. It is, however, quite telling, I'm Spanish, that the Spanish trade policy, or the positions of Spanish trade policy in Brussels have been basically the same for the last 20 years, regardless of the color of the government in Madrid. Whereas it looks as if the two big parties in Spain have very different views about the economy and about everything, but in reality, the trade policy is the same, which is to promote the export of Spanish companies abroad, gain markets in Latin America, and protect a bit against sensitive sectors of agriculture in Spain. So therefore, I think, so why I'm saying this? To say that we need to politicize trade policy so that citizens are aware of the trade policy choices that their elected leaders are taking at the EU level. And hopefully, to come back to Almudena, maybe this could be one way to contribute to maybe human rights being more at the center of trade policy making.
Thanks a lot, Sergi. I mean, that's indeed there is kind of like this siloed approach, as in like the trade community and environmental community work a bit in silos. I think things are changing. It's not my role as a moderator to give my opinion, but I guess we're one speaker short. I am allowed, but I think things are slowly changing. We see it with the Trade Ministers Alliance for Climate. but still, trade ministers are still the one holding the pen at the end of the day. I don't know if anyone has any other questions. If not, I do. And actually, to follow up on one of your points, Geneviève, what are the main benefits of moving to more local productions? Because we have seen that in some cases, for instance, it's not particularly more sustainable to produce at home, but in some cases it might be. So what are the benefits in your view to move towards more local products?
There are benefits. This is the famous intersection between pardon. Excuse me. Yes, they are benefits, and we are at the core of this famous intersection between sustainability and autonomy. So the first one is absolutely obvious: less transportation. That's okay. So second, maybe a better management of natural resources. We all know that we better protect what we know. And when we see the effect of what we do on natural resources, we have, the awareness of our impact can help us better protect our natural resources. So I will put this as a second point. A third point is that we can create economic clusters at local level, and this is certainly something that is wishable in many parts of the EU, where the tendency to go to the cities at the detriment of rural areas is general. And maybe a fourth one, a fairer price setting, because of the proximity between producers and consumers. So these are maybe benefits to which one does not think immediately, but which are real, and maybe the announcement of a different economy.
I don't know if you want to follow up. So then, if there are no more questions, I'll ask one last question, because I'm mindful of the time. I mean, looking forward, I mean, we're less than 3 months. There are less than 3 months ahead of us until the elections. We don't really know what will be the future of the Green Deal. But I would like to have the speaker's thoughts on, and perhaps some final remarks on how green will be the agri-food policy of the next Commission, in your view, or what would be the main challenges for the next cycle?
Who will start? Do you start?
No, you go ahead.
Okay. You may know the kind of publications of Europe, Jacques Delors. We are really in the philosophy of former President of the European Commission, Jacques Delors. And he was in Rio with me back in 1992. And he came back with a request, draw the Sustainable Development Agenda for Europe, which we did. And if you are curious, you can read the chapter 10 of the White Book on competitiveness, employment and growth. And this chapter is entitled Towards a New Model of Development. And it is a very interesting manner to combine the economic, social, and environmental aspects of sustainable development. We cannot succeed in the necessary green transformation of our economies and societies if we do not properly take into account the social and economic aspects. You cannot ask a farmer to do bio farming if he will not draw sufficient revenues from his activities. So, in my view, if we want to succeed in greening agri-food policy, And we want to succeed because farmers are the first victims of climate change, soil degradation, and so on. So we collectively want to succeed in this manner. We have to properly take into account social and economic aspects, and in a spirit of dialogue. And we had this dialogue in the European Parliament a few weeks ago, Europe, Jacques Delors, with many other organizations, including farmers associations. And really the spirit of dialogue was there, and the consensus on the fact that we need a green transition, but in respect of social and economic aspect, this was really consensual. So I really hope that this will be the result of the dialogue that has been organized by Mrs. von der Leyen recently. We need to go fast, but we need to go fast in the proper manner of openness to all the points of view, and trying to find the right compromise.
Yes, I agree. I guess it also depends on, obviously depends on the outcome of the European Parliament elections.
Of course.
And what the next commission will be, what will be the political majorities. So now I do hope that regardless of the details of the majorities in the European Parliament, which is very important, and that at least we do have done some lessons learned in terms of Europe, right? And I think that, so for example, what have we learned from the fact of not being able to agree with Mercosur on a trade agreement? Is it because we are right and the rest of the world is wrong? Is it because some countries are being unreasonable, or maybe they do have some points? What the European Parliament position? So I think it's about lessons learned from that. What is the lesson learned from the current backlash in Geneva, in particular, at WTO level, I mean, against the deforestation rules? What can we apply, how we can use it to have a more cooperative approach to addressing these regulatory issues? So I do think that, and that is possible, and it is within our reach. There is no treaty or legislation that prevents us from doing a better job. And there is also some opportunities as well. Despite the political difficulties, I want to give a positive view. There should be a sustainable food law system in the next mandate of the Commission, because this was supposed to happen this year and it didn't happen. They've postponed it. They haven't killed the initiative. Of course, it will depend on who the next Commission is. It could be that this will never happen, but it's still officially on the agenda for the next Commission. And this would be a very good opportunity to maybe lay down some principles about the kind of food systems that we want to have, and hopefully the role of trade and trade partners. There's, of course, also something that has been postponed, is the animal welfare package of legislation. This is, of course, it's a pity, and our political group is very disappointed. But it's also, I understand, not killed, but postponed. Well, that is another opportunity maybe to do things right. So what did we learn from the deforestation to avoid this backlash when we deal with animal welfare issues? And then, obviously, something that will happen, we want it or not, is the reform of the common agricultural policy, because it is scheduled to happen, and rightfully so. So what do we learn from the shortcomings of the current system? And in order to learn from that and put in place a more sustainable and more balanced and fair common agricultural policy, including, most likely, this will come again, the issue of imports, mirror clauses, equivalence or not. So therefore, there is uncertainty about the political outcome, yes, but there are also clear windows of opportunity in the coming 4 or 5 years to take things, hopefully not in the wrong, but in the right direction.
Thank you very much, Sergi. Indeed, before we look ahead, I guess we must look back and take stock of what we have achieved and lessons learned. And indeed, I think one of the lessons learned is that the EU's trade policy and agri-food trade policy must be more cooperative going forward. And I know we're running out of time, but I have one last question to Geneviève, because I know she has personally worked on the topic, and there is hope, as Sergi said, and I would like to end on a good note. And since it wasn't ladies first, now it will be ladies last. So my question to you, Geneviève, is how in the next mandate can we avoid this backlash, right? Because the greening of trade policy and agri-food trade policy will continue, hopefully. And what lessons can we learn, and what approach should the EU take going forward?
Thank you very much, Claudia. In a certain manner, it is the same kind of problem as succeeding in the greening of agro-food policy inside, because the economic, social aspects are similar to the one that I will develop. We have seen this backlash against EU unilateral measures when we were 1 year ago in Geneva and had a meeting with ambassadors, trade ambassadors from all over the world. And it was obvious to us that we had missed something, at least in our communication, but it's probably much deeper. And so we have developed a certain philosophy, the triangle philosophy. It's not only about greening trade, but it's about taking together 3 dimensions, trade, environment, and development. And so we have proposed a threefold, I would say, analysis. First, we have to modify our narrative. We know that we have a special responsibility. It's a historical responsibility, and it has been translated into a legal notion in the Paris Agreement. We have a common but differentiated responsibility, and this must be reflected in our policy. So the first point is a new narrative recognizing our special responsibility. The second point is to have a differentiated approach, because there is nothing like a global south. There are emergent economies like the Chinese one, the Indian ones, and the Brazilian ones, and so on. And there are very poor countries. And we need this specific approach to address specific problems and develop partnerships. So this is this idea of specificity and partnerships. And finally, we need new tools. We need not only new financial tools to address the specificities, but we need also to break silos. And this is true inside the EU institutions, where different departments of the Commission and different committees in the European Parliament must work together to look at these 3 aspects together from the start. But this is true also at international level, where a forum, for a triangle forum dealing with trade, environment, and development issues should be settled. It seems to us that it is starting to be developed inside the WTO, within notably the Environment Committee, which could work on that with the Development Committee.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Geneviève. And if Sergi doesn't want to add anything, then I will wrap up. I mean, I won't try to do any summary of the discussions because they were quite rich, but we have heard about the economic impacts, risks and benefits of open strategic autonomy. We've heard about the impacts on international cooperation. We've heard about the environmental benefits of local production, but also about the environmental benefits of importing some products. So I think we have some food for thought. So I'd just like to thank you all for joining us today, and to thank once again the Belgian presidency for inviting us. And thank you very much, everyone, and feel free to reach out after the session.